So today I want to talk about pot stills, specifically what a pot still was in the past and what a pot still is today, and what it could be in a few years. So historically, barley was the grain that we used to make spirits in Ireland and Scotland because barley grows well in wet weather. Um, when you malt barley, you get a decent amount of sugar from it. It was used in brewing, and like people are people, and we use what's close to hand. I've no historical evidence for why barley became the grain of choice when we also grew rye and wheat in smaller amounts. But it's probably because it's popular, because that's the way humans work. Historically, though, we're probably also looking at like other grains mixed in there, like the the whiskey Padder made in his little on his tenement farm back in the 1600s is probably completely different to something made in a distillery today. You're talking about floor malted barley that's dried with peat from the fire, and there's probably oats in there as well if he has oats lying around. There's any spare grain lying over. This is how you preserve it, and then you can sell it off, and then maybe you're using that money to supplement your income. You know, oats and wheat and rye, they all bring a different thing to a distillation. I'm not a distiller, not a scientist, but I do know that when you ferment rye, it creates a massive amount of foam. That's a pain in the ass to deal with, and that oats fuck your stills. So it's probably just kind of transition towards barley most of the time, and these if you have to use them. Then in the 1700s, we get the malted barley tax, the tax on to encourage people to stop illegally distilling, which is also incidentally where poaching came from. Put that in little pot. People were making it in little pots, so they didn't have to pay the tax man because they could just throw it the fuck away. So people are being encouraged to do it legally. It's just now the stuff you use to make it is more expensive. That's how the government's going to make their money. So how do you get around that? Well, you use other grains, supplement with other grains that are cheaper. And we have like reports from John Power that his mash bill may have had up to 30% oats, and I don't want to think about the cleanup job that left behind. You've got stuff like you probably had like wheat and rye because we're buying in grain from the empire as well, so it's not just grain from Ireland. Corn and maize, well, we don't use them because they don't grow here. But when we move over to the States, us and our neighbours, and most of us are working in stud farms down in Kentucky because there's good money there. And then we're using the grain that's nearby, which is corn, and we're supplementing that with a small amount of malted barley because another thing barley is good for is enzymes. It'll the enzymes from barley help in the fermentation process. Nowadays, under modern law, I believe we can add enzymes to the distillation process. Again, not a distiller, so you don't have to use malted barley unless you want to call it whiskey, because it must, under law, contain a portion of malted barley. Um, that's the thing I really wanted to talk about, though, is because recently I came across this. This is Kilbeggan Small Batch Rye. Now, Kilbeggan Small Batch Rye started its life as a pot still whiskey. Initially, the only company in Ireland making pot still was Midleton, and they even discontinued. They were this close to discontinuing making single pot still. Like you had Redbreast 12 being discontinued in the 90s and only brought back because Jim Murray wrote about it in his Whiskey Bible. We won't really talk much about him because problematic. And then you've got Mitchell and Sons, who were still getting Midleton to produce Greenspot for them. And like these are the single two expressions of single pot still whiskey, the traditional Irish style. And so Kilbeggan Distillery, owned by John Teeling, start making single pot stills. One of them is 2.5% oats, and another one of them is 20% rye in the mash bill. They're double distilled, which is very, very strange for a pot still. Pot still, I believe, and this is a personal theory, it's not anyone else's, that Irish triple distillation comes not only from the massive amount of spirit we were producing, like we're making whiskey in industrial perfume stills, to like compete with the demand that everyone in the world wanted our spirit. But also because if you use malted and unmalted barley, you're not getting as much alcohol, because unmalted barley, well, it doesn't have as much sugar in it. There's not much stuff for yeast to feed on. So you squeeze out all the alcohol either via third distillation or distilling slower. And, well, to deal with demand, you're not going to do things slower. So the Kilbeggan rye pot still is 20% rye in the mash bill, which adds a completely different character to a whiskey, creates something really interesting. But what happens then is a technical file is drawn up and submitted for a geographic indicator, a protection as to what Irish single pot still whiskey is. Geographic indicators are the kind of things that protect Champagne, Cognac, Iberian ham, two specific types of apples in Brittany. Basically, like they're a protection, and we don't have the exact thing. We don't have the exact copywriting that says single pot still can only be made in Ireland, which is why we see stuff like Talnua in the States, and I believe there's one or two single pot still distilleries in Australia that have won awards. But the technical file for Irish contains up to 5% other grains, because the only major company making it at the time was Midleton, who didn't particularly want something very far off Redbreast or Green Spot, or if we're generous and we don't do a corporate read, they knew they were the only ones making it, so they didn't want to challenge themselves too much by like mixing in a bunch of other grains for something that they didn't see becoming popular. So, because rye is not a protected term in Ireland, and small batch isn't, Kilbeggan small batch rye. Now, you can't really find this anymore. It's discontinued after Beam Suntory bought the Kilbeggan distillery, and their focus was not on creating new and experimental and really cool whiskies. But if you do see it, give it a try, because it is a throwback to like the kind of stuff we would have been making. If you see stuff from Blackwater, like the dirt grains, they're also using these historical mash bills, and they're really cool. And within the next year or so, we're going to be seeing a lot of what's called non-compliant pot still. Stuff that is technically pot still under its historic definition, but is not pot still under the legal definition. And we may see that change, and the signature spirit of Ireland becoming a little bit more different. And we're also going to see more countries make it, which I'm really interested in, because there's some stuff like Talnua do a Solera aged pot still, which is fucking rad. I really want to get my hands on that. And we might see other places do things with like grains that are not really common here in Ireland, and it's a cool thing to be excited about.